So they're responsible.
They are. Bob has been the president for a number of years. One book that he wrote, was published just a couple of years ago, was A Church in Search of Itself. I think that's the title. A Church in Search of Itself. It was the story of the election, if you please, of Pope Benedict to be the Pope. I've read a lot of church history and a lot of other things. I've never read the history of the Catholic Church in such a strong, beautiful way as in that book. So Bob is here to speak from the Catholic standpoint, or from some standpoint, I don't know where to go, but we appreciate so much, Bob, your being here. Do it for about 15 minutes,
Okay.
and then when Senator Sinema comes, she'll speak for about 15 minutes. Then we'll have time for questions.
Terrific.
It's all yours.
Okay, will you want to come up to the...
No, I'm comfortable here.
Okay, then I might move over. Excuse me.
I should clarify a bit. I'm not a Jesuit any longer. I studied to be a Jesuit priest for 10 years and left 3 years shy of ordination to come back to my home in Phoenix and enter the field of journalism. And so I worked for 3 years for the Arizona Republic, and then by a stroke of luck, some call it divine providence, I got a job with Time magazine, and they sent me to Rome to cover the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, which I did. And I wrote one of the first books on that affair, which was an effort on the part of Pope John the 23rd, whom I considered the greatest pope in history, to create a people's church, not a clerical church. The charter that was written at that council didn't quite take, because the successors, Pope Paul VI and John Paul II notably, put on the brakes, and they did not want a people's church. They wanted to keep things tight to themselves. I am still a Jesuit at heart. The training, 10-year training, took, I guess. But one of the pieces of the training, they taught us how to think. And so, as president of an organization in Phoenix called the Jesuit Alumni in Arizona, graduates of 28 Jesuit colleges and universities around the country and 49 high schools who live in Arizona. There are about 2,000 members in my organization. There may be as many as 20,000 Jesuit alumni around the state, because a lot of these people come from places in the country that find Arizona to be very nice and compatible, and they've moved from Detroit and Cleveland and so forth. God, I'm expecting... Well, I'm not going to answer it because...
Let's have everybody else silence your phone, please.
Let me just tell them all. I'm in the middle of a speech. I'll have to call you back. One of our mantras in the Jesuit alumni in Arizona is for a thinking church in Arizona. So we're considered rather subversive by our bishop, Bishop Olmsted, who, in fact, last year, I believe it was last year, it might have been a little longer ago than that, sent $50,000 to, I believe it was the state of Rhode Island, to fight a bill that would legalize gay marriage. He did this on his own without consulting anybody in the diocese, because that's the way many bishops act, very unilaterally. They're absolute rulers ruling absolutely, taking their model from the Pope himself, who is probably one of the last people on earth who is an absolute ruler ruling absolutely. The Pope makes all the laws, interprets all the laws, and enforces all the laws, and so it becomes a very closed society. Quickly jumping to the issue at hand this morning, the suitability or the non-suitability or the advisability or the non-advisability of the state allowing two gay couples to marry is much mooted right now and argued in Australia, for one place. They're considering it very seriously. In other parts of the world, I'm not sure what Canada has done on this, but it's an area where the needs of the state somehow intersect with the freedom that we, in America at least, try to give people in general, that they ought to be allowed to do what they want. But, of course, that has limits. I couldn't build a nuclear reactor in my backyard. It would be subject to certain controls. This guy go away. You know what I mean?
Maybe you can just turn it off.
You know?
Can't do that.
You're brilliant. I just did. Thank you. I was saying that the state does think it has and has had through the history of our country a reason to regulate marriage. They talk a lot about the common good. What has happened, however, in the last century, perhaps even in the last 30 or 40 years, is that we have a militant organization of gays and lesbians and others who believe that they have a right to marry whom they wish, and that right should not militate against what the state calls the common good. Now, the Catholic Church, when I say the Catholic Church, I mean the hierarchy, because as Dr. Eppinger pointed out, or didn't point out, but he talked about the Catholic view. You guys are sophisticated enough to know that there is no the Catholic view, that we have a wide body of opinion in the church. We have a left wing, a middle of the ground, and a right wing. And the left wing and the right wing in the church are constantly battling over a bunch of issues, including principally one of the main battles is over the ordination of women. The hierarchy, the Pope and his bishops maintain that the priesthood is for women only. Excuse me, for men only. What a slip is that? Frankly, I'm of two minds on this. I think we'd have a better priesthood if we had women in it. But it would be fascinating for me, a journalist, to observe what would happen to the priesthood in the United States when, as and if, we have women priests. We have some little peek at the future by looking at the Anglicans, who do have women priests. But as I understand it, and I could be corrected on this, the women priests in the Anglican Church, in England at least, are kind of second-class citizens within the priesthood. And so I'm not sure, what would happen in the United States. The United States is different than most of the other countries in the world. We seem to be a little advanced in a lot of areas, and often enough because women in this country have taken the lead in, say, getting the vote. For about 40 years, they fought to get the right to vote. And you'd think, today, what should be more clear? That all citizens should be able to vote, at least when they reach the age of majority. And yet, they had to battle, the women had to battle, mainly the U.S. Congress, for 40 years in order to finally get the vote in 1920. Was that progress? I would think so. Would it be progress if we elected a woman president? Yeah, I would think so. We would probably have less war if we had a woman president.
Here, here.
So, I think that my task this morning is to try to give you, as objectively as I can, what the Pope and his bishops say about gay marriage, and then what others are saying who are good Catholics. And just to try to sum up, I went on the internet last week and downloaded several long statements from the Vatican. One of them is called Considerations Regarding Proposals to Give Legal Recognition to Unions Between Homosexual Persons. And it starts out by saying that their aim in producing this document is to protect and promote the dignity of marriage, the foundation of the family, and the stability of society. And it tries to make a case. And at times it makes a good case, and at times it slops over into areas that the church has already shown, I'm talking about the hierarchy again, the church has already shown itself to be less than competent in areas of sexuality particularly. I was in Rome covering the Vatican Council, and during that period we had something called the Papal Birth Control Commission. Never happened before in the history of the church, where the Pope would gather together 73 people, philosophers, theologians, demographers, sociologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, 3 married couples, and so forth, to re-examine the church's traditional ban on contraception. It wasn't an ancient ban, it only was put in place in 1931. And now, during Vatican II, where everything was open up for grabs, the Pope himself decided, let's re-examine this doctrine that every time a Catholic couple lies down together, that they have to intend to make a baby, and if they don't, it's just an accident. That lovemaking is connected intimately with baby making. That wasn't an assumption that the Papal Birth Control Commission examined and found wanting. They started out being basically a bunch of very loyal Catholics, I would almost say right-wing Catholics, very conservative, very traditional, and over the course of 3 years of meetings, on and off, in the Vatican, they moved from one end of the spectrum to the other, and ended up telling the Pope, we've got to change the rules on this, that in fact, whether a couple want children or not is up to the couple, and they should make their conscience-filled decision based on their own reason, and consult, if anybody, they should consult their doctors, and if they wish, their pastors, but that it's up to the couple, and that since the rules on contraception were not of faith, that is, they didn't come from the Bible as such, but they came from human reason, then we could use human reason to work out some new rules, as it were. Or I shouldn't say rules, because a lot of even Catholics believe that whatever the Pope says, we've got to do it or be damned and go to hell. The Fathers of Vatican II said quite the opposite, that it's up to us, and that we too have to use our reason, and if the reasons that the Pope gives to do A, B, and C, or not do X, Y, and Z are wanting, rationally wanting, then we not only have a right to not follow them, we have a duty not to follow them. So the analogy to the Papal Birth Control Commission, which, by the way, was deep sixed by the Pope himself after they delivered their conclusions, I wrote a whole book on this called Politics of Sex and Religion. The Pope decided that the Church would not change its teaching on birth control. Many Catholics believe that that was the end of it. The Pope said so, and therefore we have to follow. But a majority of Catholics in the Western world, at least, Catholic couples, were practicing contraception then and continue to practice it in good conscience. They don't feel like they're breaking God's law. They may be going contrary to what the Pope is saying, but the Pope doesn't know everything, specifically about sex. How could he? Why should he? You know, he comes from Paul VI came from a culture where he was trained, educated at home, and he wasn't allowed to even go to classes with young women. So, you know, he was way out of it as far as women were concerned. So that's kind of prefatory to... I'm trying to tell you what the Vatican thinks about gay marriage.
About
5 more minutes. Okay. The document says they want to help safeguard public morality and, above all, avoid exposing young people to erroneous ideas about sexuality and marriage that would deprive them of their necessary defenses and contribute to the spread of the phenomenon. And I think that that's a concern that they have. I think some of it is well placed and some of it is not well placed. But they also talk about violence to the children and the best interest of the child. But so far, I don't think that there have been any significant studies that prove that children of two women who are married and bringing up the child, that the child is going to suffer any more notably than my children suffered when they were living with me and my wife, where we were a heterosexual couple. As a matter of fact, my wife and I were divorced, and the children were all of a sudden in a single-parent household. Was that good for the children? No. So there's no guarantee that even a heterosexual marriage will be great for the kids. Half of the marriages in this country are ending up in divorce. And society is concerned about that, and therefore, when the Pope and his bishops argue against the upset of society if we allow gay marriage, you must understand where they're coming from. They're very traditional, and they have kind of skewed idea of sexuality. They fear sex, for one thing. They became celibates partly because they feared sex. And they have a funny equation that sex equals evil equals women. And so that's one of the reasons they don't want women priests. Well, I only have a couple more minutes, and we'll answer some of your questions afterward, but I do have to point out that the Pope is being argued against by a Jesuit in Australia named Frank Brennan, who is a lawyer and one of the top Jesuits in Australia, who just wrote a piece on March the 9th, which isn't very long ago, in which he says, I remain of the view that we should not extend the definition of marriage to include same-sex unions, that we should legislate to recognize same-sex unions, and that we should leave questions about the legal availability of new technologies for the creation of children by same-sex couples for determination at a later date. In general, he says, although there's never been an ideal time when all children were born into a marriage, we have maintained marriage as the ideal institution for the raising of children by their biological parents. And that's pretty much what society, even in the United States, thinks today. In general, we like to think that kids are going to grow up with a mom and a dad, and that's good. Is it better than a child growing up in a household that is partnered by two women or by two men? The answer is we don't know. We have to see. But Father Brennan says in opposition to the Pope, there are homosexual persons who enter into loving, faithful, and committed relationships. These persons should be able to live in society free from discrimination, without state interference, and with state support and approval. They should enjoy the same state protection as de facto couples enjoy under existing state and territory laws. It is very difficult to characterize such a law giving this non-discriminatory protection to same-sex couples as, quote, and he's quoting the Pope, so harmful to the common good as to be gravely immoral. He really pins the Pope down on this. I don't think in any kind of an open dialogue, the Pope or any of his minions, including the Bishop of Phoenix, Tom Olmsted, could defend that proposition. So all I can say is there is no single church view on this. There are thinking Catholics who oppose people like Benedict XVI and our bishop here in Phoenix, who are so adamantly against gay marriage that even Olmsted would send $50,000 of our money to Rhode Island to combat the legalization of gay marriage. So I'll be here for questions. I think I've done enough. Good. Okay, good. Okay, thank you.
We will have the second presentation. When that's finished, for about 15, 20 minutes or so.
Sure.
And when that's finished, then we'll open it up for questions for anybody hearing us. Senator Kirsten Sinema, who is here, coming out of a very busy time, and busy all morning and going back to Senate business this afternoon. Thank you, Senator, for being here.
Thanks. Well, I apologize for coming in late and having to leave quickly, but just on the street, the legislature is destroying our state, so I want to make sure I'm not gone for very long. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about my views and the views of some of the folks I represent, both here in Arizona and around the nation, on the issue of same-sex marriage. And for many of you, you probably know I'm also an attorney, and I focus on constitutional law. So I think what I'll do is start with some of the arguments that have been raised around same-sex marriage from the state perspective. As we know, there are now 5 states, plus the District of Columbia in the United States, that recognize same-sex marriage. There are several additional states that, while they don't provide marriage licenses to same-sex couples, they do recognize same-sex marriages that have been formed in other states. Maryland, New York are examples of some of those states. Basically, the way that the same-sex marriage fight really started in our country's history was back in the mid-90s in the state of Hawaii. In the mid-90s in the state of Hawaii, a gay couple decided they wanted to get married. They went to a courthouse, applied to be married. They were denied the opportunity to marry because they were an opposite-sex couple. They sued, and the Supreme Court indicated that they did indeed have the right to marry, because in that court's opinion, there was no rational state interest to deny marriage rights to same-sex individuals. And that's an important term, the term rational state interest. That is the crux of the definition that courts use to determine whether or not it's okay to treat one group of people differently than you treat another group of people. In the United States, we have the 14th Amendment, which, as you know, currently, the 14th Amendment provides equal protection and due process to all individuals. Also, incidentally, separate from this debate, it says if you're born in this country, you're a citizen. That's under debate today, too, at the state capitol. But the Equal Protection Clause says that any two people who are similarly situated must be treated the same by the government. And that if the government wants to treat those two people differently, they have to show that there's a rational state interest, a legitimate government purpose to treat those two communities differently. Now, the courts over time have expanded that very question to include 3 levels of scrutiny. So if an individual who is Anglo is treated differently than an individual who is African American, Our country does apply the rational state interest test, but they used what's called a strict scrutiny test, which means they're going to look very, very carefully at that state action because they believe that it's really hard to give a legitimate state interest of why you would treat a white person differently than an African American person. Now that all grew out of, as we all know and recall, the civil rights movement, where individuals of one race were allowed to sit at the front of buses and at counters and et cetera, and drink certain water fountains, while people of other races were prohibited from doing so. The government struck down those laws and said that they were, quote, de jure discrimination. De jure is Latin for in the law. So what the court said at that time was you can't actually discriminate against people in writing in the law unless you have a really, really good reason to do so. So the strict scrutiny rule is used anytime race is an issue. There is not a single law in this country today that allows for discrimination between people of various races because the courts have upheld the idea that there is no such thing as any rational reason that a government would discriminate against people because of their race. Then there's a mid-level scrutiny, and the mid-level scrutiny is afforded only to women. Women are the only group of the country that receive some form of protected scrutiny status, but not full protection. And so there are some laws in this country that discriminate against women. There are some policies and practices that still discriminate against women. For instance, women are not allowed to serve in combat in the military. They're not allowed to serve in the SEALs, Navy SEALs. They're not allowed to serve on submarines. Now, I think that will probably go away soon, and we've been moving towards women having greater and greater opportunities and rights in the military, but that's one good example of how the government has said it's okay to discriminate against women in some instances, and then they have to give a really good reason of why they're doing so. Again, that's the mid-level scrutiny. Then the lowest level of scrutiny is called the rational basis level. The rational basis level simply says that the government has to provide a compelling state interest of why they're discriminating against one group of people while granting rights or benefits to another group of people. The rational basis test applies to gay people in this country. Gay people are not a protected class. And that's why it's legal in 19 states in this country to fire someone simply because they're gay, including here in Arizona. Some of you probably didn't know that. It's totally legal to fire someone for being gay. It's also legal to fire someone because you think they're gay in Arizona. It's also legal to deny housing to someone because they're gay. Now it is, and this is critical, it's very illegal to do those very same things to someone because they're a woman or a person of color or an alien who has legal status here, so an immigrant. It's illegal to discriminate against people for age. So you can't fire someone just because they're getting older in this country. But it is legal to treat gay people differently in this country. And that's because the government uses what's called the rational basis test. Now, I can't defend what the rational basis is of why it's okay to fire gay people. I have absolutely nothing to offer you in that area. It seems to me that the sexual orientation of a person has and should have no bearing on their ability to perform a job or a duty. But nonetheless, because we use the rational basis test to discriminate between straight and gay people, those laws are legal in this country. And that is how we get to a place where same-sex marriage is illegal in most parts of the country. The federal government passed a law shortly after Hawaii's endeavor, implementing what they call DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. So what the federal government did after Hawaii moved forward with same-sex marriage, the federal government said, wait a second here, we don't want this spreading to other places. So they carved out an exception in our law to prevent same-sex couples from receiving recognition in other states. So at the same time, Hawaii also did a ballot initiative where they overturned the constitutional interpretation by their Supreme Court and prohibited gay marriage in their state constitution. So Hawaii was the first state in the country to do that. And that was by popular vote. And so that was really not a question of legality, that was a question of the people's will. That was back in the late 90s. After that time, in 2004, there were about 17 states in the country that faced ballot initiatives to ban same-sex marriage. Every single one of them passed. In 2006, that number increased to 32 states. Today, that number is up to 36 states. There are 36 states in the country that have amended their state constitutions to specifically prohibit the recognition of same-sex marriage. And most of those have withstood scrutiny because a state constitutional provision can't be challenged in a state court. Only a federal court can strike down a state constitutional provision. And this issue is winding its way currently up the federal court system from California, but it has not yet reached the United States Supreme Court. So as we saw in the late 90s through around 2006, states all across the country are passing these measures to ban same-sex marriage. At the very same time, several other states were either passing legislation to grant same-sex marriage to couples, or states that had not passed a constitutional amendment were seeing court cases move through their court system to the state Supreme Court, challenging this very question of the rational state interest. And I think that probably the best example is the example of Iowa. In Iowa, the state Supreme Court ruled that the state has no rational interest, no rational basis by which to discriminate between gay and straight people in terms of marriage. Of course, the opponents of same-sex marriage put forth arguments that have been put forth in every single court case in our country's history regarding this issue. And that is that the state does indeed have a rational interest in marriage. Now, it's important to note that there are probably some people in this room who don't believe that the state should have any role in marriage whatsoever. Historically, marriage was a religious institution. Only since the institution of our country's founding did marriage also become a state matter. So we have two systems of marriage in our country. We have religious marriages, which are defined and regulated solely by the faiths that officiate and choose who can and who cannot be married. The state has no interest in that. That is purely a religious endeavor, and there are very serious protections around religion in this very same provision of the Equal Protection Clause. It is illegal to discriminate against people because of their religion in this country. And there's quite a bit of case law in the Supreme Court that supports that. So a religion can choose to marry or not marry same-sex couples, and that's a private matter and a private entity that's engaging in that behavior. But when the state became involved in marriage by regulating the contracts of marriage, which is what we call civil marriage, then the state began to have an interest in marriage. So a civil marriage is a marriage where you may have a religious ceremony, but you also have an interaction with your local court, where you go apply, pay a fee, and get a license to marry. Once you are married and it's officiated and signed by the appropriate authorized persons, then you present that marriage certificate back to the state, and you have a legally binding and legally recognized contract, a civil contract that's enforceable under state law. And that's why when a couple wants to get divorced, they can't just say goodbye and walk away. If they've been civilly married and are recognized by the state, they have to have a civil divorce. So they have to go petition the court, file paperwork, and nullify that contract that they have made with the state. So this is why marriage is also a state concern, because our country decided that the government had a role to play in these contracts between two consenting adults. And the government has a long history of regulating marriage. For instance, here in Arizona, it is illegal to marry your sibling. It is legal to marry your first cousin if you're over a certain age or one of you is celibate. But it is not usually legal to marry a relative. And the government has said that they have a rational state interest. Because as we know, when close relatives marry each other, and if they do have progeny, there are substantial risks for disabilities because of the very close genetic makeup of the two parents. So that's why in Arizona, there's a state statute that says that siblings cannot marry, neither can a parent and a child, but that first cousins can marry. Even though they have close genetic DNA, they can still marry as long as one person is celibate. Not celibate, I apologize. One person is unable to have children, or they're over the age of 65, which would make it At least right now, according to medical science, impossible to have a child.
Highly improbable.
Right. It could happen maybe one day, but it's very unlikely. So the state does have an interest in regulating marriage. The state also has, as we know, regulated against polygamy. Polygamy is illegal in Arizona and all the 50 states. And so the state has a history of regulating marriage. The question presented by the issue of gay marriage is, what is the state interest in discriminating against people who are of the same sex getting married? What is the state interest? And arguments have been made to say that there is a state interest in restricting marriage to heterosexual couples have largely been related to issues concerning children. So the majority arguments that we see coming from the pro-heterosexual marriage, anti-same-sex marriage camp is about the giving birth to and raising of children. Now, that is an important function. It doesn't necessarily happen in the confines of marriage. In Arizona, nearly 40% of childbirths happen outside of marriage today. So while marriage may be an important part of the child giving and rearing process, it is not considered legally an integral part because there is no penalty for an individual getting pregnant and giving birth or adopting a child outside the confines of marriage. So while child rearing is certainly an important state interest, the state does have an interest in ensuring that children are being raised in a healthy and safe environment. That's why we have child protective service laws. The state does not necessarily have a strong argument when it comes to saying that children should only be reared in the context of marriage, because as we know, that is not the case in Arizona. 60% of all marriages in Arizona result in divorce. And as I said, nearly half of all children who are born in Arizona today are born outside the confines of marriage. Now, those are two statistics to potentially cause concern for individuals in this room. And I would agree that those are concerning statistics. Banning same-sex marriage, however, has had no impact on those statistics because those are between heterosexual partners and families. The other argument that is often being used is that a two-parent family is the best family for a child. And while there are certainly studies to show that the households in which you have two parents do help children in some instances, sometimes in socialization instances, that there is no negative impact simply from having a single-parent household. That there are other factors are much, much more concerning, such as the income of the parents, the education of the parents, their ability to provide for the child's social, emotional, medical, physical needs. In addition, there have been studies to show that children who are reared in two-parent same-sex couples show at least the same level of healthy socialization by the age of 18 as do heterosexual couples as well. This is particularly important in Arizona because 1 in 3 lesbian couples in Arizona has children. 1 in 3. Amongst gay male couples, that number is 1 in 5. So the prevalence of children being reared in same-sex families is actually increasing at a very rapid rate. And it's happening by a variety of ways. In the instance of gay male couples, many individuals are choosing to adopt children, which I think we would agree is generally a social good, to help provide children a loving home when they don't have access to one already. In particular, gay couples are more likely to adopt children who are hard to place, children who are older, children who are of color, and children who have special needs, physical, emotional, medical needs. Amongst lesbian couples that have children, there are 3 ways in which lesbian couples have children today. One is through natural childbirth. So I know that's interesting. People are like, how does that happen? Well, biology still works for many people. And there are some lesbian couples where an individual chooses to get to be impregnated by someone who is close to them, maybe a friend or maybe their partner's family member or something along those lines, and they get pregnant the good old-fashioned way. In addition, there are many lesbian couples who have children from previous marriages when they were in heterosexual relationships. The second is through in vitro fertilization or other types of assistive technology. As we all know, the technology is very, very sophisticated, and many individuals, both straight and gay, many women choose to utilize these medical services to help them get pregnant. It's also a very common occurrence amongst straight married couples as well, who for whatever reason are having difficulty getting pregnant on their own. So many lesbians choose to become pregnant and bear children using IVF methods. And the final method, of course, is adoption, which is very popular amongst women, in particular, single straight women and gay women. And so the arguments that are being made against prohibiting same-sex marriage are also largely surrounded by issues of children. As more and more gay couples have children, either through nature or through courts with adoption, or through medical science and technology with IVF, more and more gay people today do find themselves rearing families. And they are asking for the same kind of legal protections that are offered to heterosexual married families so that they can protect their children. For instance, in Arizona, if a gay couple has chosen to adopt a child, only one person in that couple has the legal right to adopt the child. So while the other person bears much responsibility, they have no legal responsibility to parenting. And if the gay parent, who is the adoptive parent, were to go into a coma or pass away, the other parent has no legal right to their child. None whatsoever. Now that is certainly a danger to children, because then we have children who are going in the foster care system, perhaps go to live with the parents, the deceased person's parents. So this child is now put back into legal limbo. So there's a growing body of evidence from a legal perspective to show that the state does have a rational interest in providing for same-sex marriage, simply and solely to protect those children. There are other arguments that are made by same-sex couples supporting marriage, one of which is simply a financial one. And that is that there are 1,100 federal benefits that accrue to married couples that are denied to same-sex couples, regardless of whether or not they have a legal marriage in any state in this country. Under the federal law, they are denied those federal benefits. That's 1,100 legal benefits they are denied. That includes things like the right to visit your loved one in the hospital during an emergent time. It includes a denial of a right to inherit your partner's belongings without a will. It involves things like not having the ability to care for your own children if the adoptive parent is incapacitated or deceased. It involves things like not having the right to make burial decisions about your partner if he or she passes away. Because individuals are denied legal rights to marry, they do not have the same rights that many married people and many unmarried people, but who are heterosexual, take for granted. For instance, if I was married to a man and I were to pass away, he would get to decide whether I am cremated or whether I'm buried and where that would happen and when. He decides everything. But if my partner were a woman and I were to pass away, my parents would have the legal right to make that decision, not my partner, even if I haven't spoken to my parents in over 30 years, right? Which is the case for some, but not all, same-sex couples. So the arguments around equal protection are very tenuous, and they're rapidly changing. The historical arguments, the traditional arguments, to say that marriage should be reserved only for heterosexual couples because of the issue of child rearing is no longer either factually appropriate or relevant today. Because heterosexual couples, just like same-sex couples, are rearing children at very, very high rates. And as we know, many heterosexual couples in this country, including the state, choose to raise families without having the legal protections of marriage. And so what's happening, effectively, is that one group of individuals who want the same legal protections to both their relationship and to their family are denied that simply because the gender of the person that they have chosen to partner with is the same gender as their own. And as we have seen in Supreme Courts across the country now, both in California, in Iowa, in Massachusetts, and other states, we have seen courts hold that there is no rational basis. There is no rational basis and no legitimate state interest in denying the benefits of marriage to individuals simply because their partner is of the same gender of them. In fact, there's a growing body of evidence to show that individuals should be granted that right for those very same legitimate state interests of protecting contracts and protecting families. Now, the interesting thing here is that there's often a debate, often injected into this debate is the question of religion. And the question of religion is a very important question. I'm a firm believer in the First Amendment, which provides that individuals should have free exercise of religion, and those should also be free from religion if they choose to do so. And because our country has such a strong commitment to freedom of and freedom from religion, the state has taken very little interest or initiative to regulate religion. And that's appropriate. That's what our founding fathers intended. In fact, as we know, many of them are coming because of religious persecution themselves. That's how this country was founded. And so we believe very strongly in that. It's important to note that the debate around same-sex marriage is a civil and legal debate. It is not a debate that impacts religion. Religions can, should, and will continue to have every right as independent private entities to make their own decisions about what kinds of relationships they will sanction and what kinds they will shun, or what kinds they will choose to recognize and which kinds they will choose not to recognize. The state has no legitimate interest whatsoever in regulating what a religion does in terms of recognizing or not recognizing relationships within the confine of that faith. And so as we move forward with this debate, we are seeing courts more and more frequently understanding and recognizing the division between religion and the civil law here. The civil law, I think, is very clear. There is not a legitimate reason to discriminate against individuals of the same sex who want to engage in civil contracts and provide some kind of legal protection for their children should they choose to have some. Religions, on the other hand, have every right in which to make decisions. My personal opinion, of course, is that that religion over time, I think, will become more open and more accepting of same-sex families because they recognize that those same-sex families and individuals love their version of a creator just as much as everyone else in that faith community. But in terms of deciding whether or not to recognize a relationship or a union, that is and always should be, and I believe always will be, solely the purview of that private entity, and religions can make whatever decision they choose based on their own faith and their own tenets. Thanks.
Okay. How long can you stay with us?
I can probably do another 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Questions? Let me make my little speech that I make every time. Tex Sample, who is the chairman of the Education Committee in charge of this, called me last night. Paul, I've got pneumonia. I can't be there today. That's why I'm doing the same today. But the speech I was making is this. 3 little words: understanding, respect, support. Take the word respect. Questions are open to anyone here today. They must be respectful questions, asked in a respectful way. Please don't have come here today with your own little speech that you want to shoot out to everybody. Just ask a simple question to either the senator or to Mr. Kaiser, and then we'll go from there. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
For the senator, I know in Massachusetts, I'm a lawyer as well, and I know in the Massachusetts Supreme Court decision, they found very compelling and undermining of the state's position the fact that the state offered no legal barriers to same-sex couples adopting children. They felt that really undercut the state's position that somehow they had to do this to protect children. Does Arizona have any impediments, legal impediments, to same-sex couples adopting children?
That's a great question. Right now in Arizona, a same-sex couple cannot legally adopt. Only an individual gay adult can adopt. And so if a couple chooses to adopt, one person will be the legal adoptive parent. And then what usually happens is the other adult engages in a civil contract that is privately created by an attorney to grant both the benefits and the responsibilities of parentage to that other partner. However, Arizona courts can and have ignored that civil contract because, of course, as we know, courts can say what's in the best interest of the state, so they can ignore that they want. What I recommend that same-sex couples do if they want to adopt a child is, quite frankly, go to California and adopt a child. Because in California, you can have same-sex adoption with both parents. If you go to California and adopt, both parents are on the birth certificate, the adopted birth certificate. And when they come back to Arizona, Arizona courts do recognize the legal rights of both parents if they come from another state with that adoptive
So we're picking and choosing
rights.
where we're going to recognize full faith and
We
credit.
are. That's exactly right. And one more point that's important. There is a piece of legislation that passed through the Senate last week and has moved to the House this week that would make it much, much more difficult for single people in Arizona to adopt. Now, while the legislation is facially neutral, it does not specifically target a certain orientation of individuals, it will negatively impact same-sex individuals who are in a loving partnership, but it will also negatively impact single heterosexual women, who are the second largest group of adoptive parents in Arizona. So there is legislation moving forward that would seek to further discriminate against homosexual individuals who seek to adopt children in Arizona.
Okay, yeah. Pat?
Thank you. Mr. Kaiser, isn't it true that the Catholic Church's opposition to same-sex marriage is based in the belief that homosexuality is a choice and aberrant behavior, when in fact science has proven this not to be the case?
The church's official position is that the orientation is not immoral, but the homosexual acts are immoral. And so when it would contemplate allowing gay couples to marry, put the church's blessing on promises exchanged between a gay couple, that is probably predicated on the idea that what they're doing is immoral.
But isn't the church's attitude based on the belief that homosexuality is a choice and not something that one is born with?
I don't think they know. I don't think they really know.
It is my understanding that recent statements have implied, if not openly asserted, that one's sexual orientation is what they would call a preference rather than an orientation. Those two terms are important. Sexual preference implies that you have a choice, that you prefer, broccoli to carrots. An orientation is the direction in which one is facing, and that's not something that one can change.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Ed?
When I wrote my arguments against both the marriage propositions and the together, I had a friend call me, and she said, I understand, I believe in all the civil rights, but I can't get over the word marriage. I have to vote against it because I can't see same-sex union as a marriage, using that word specifically. And so she's apologizing to me for voting against the way I'm arguing. What I was arguing, though, is equal protection. Can you give those 1,100 benefits and all of these other things to people without marriage? And is marriage a civil right in that respect?
I think from a legal perspective, the only way that you could truly adhere to the Equal Protection Clause and not call a gay marriage a marriage is if you also stopped calling a straight marriage a marriage. And I don't think that's what Americans want. I think Americans have some emotional attachment to the word marriage, right?
Both ways.
So, yes. So from a strict interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause, there's really no legitimate reason to say one is a union and one is a marriage. If the exact same legal rights and benefits are attached, then it is the same thing and should be called the same thing.
Just to follow.
Yeah, just a second. Mr. Kaiser.
You say the word marriage. It seems like we're wasting a lot of time and energy arguing over this in this country when we have a model in Mexico and many other nations in Latin America where everybody goes to the civil arm, whatever it is, and get hitched, and then either they go to their own churches or they don't, to have it solemnized or blessed, as it were, and that's up to the individual. So everybody's on the same level in Mexico and Latin America. Why don't we do that?
That was basically my follow-up. The hang-up is on the word marriage,
Yeah.
possibly,
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for that very concise and thorough speech. I'd like to have it on tape. Can we get it?
It's on tape.
Do you go to churches and speak? Have you been asked to do that?
I was at the UU Church in the West Valley last Sunday, and I do. I'm happy to speak at any faith service. I typically speak after the services, but I will tell you this: imagine my surprise when I got to the UU Church last Sunday and it said sermon, Kirsten sermon. I was like, oh, I'm not really prepared for that. But it went just fine. We had a nice discussion. So I'm happy to talk to any group that's interested, faith or non-faith based.
Reverend, we're delighted to have you here.
Oh, but
Okay, other questions? Yeah.
This is
Surely.
a real question. Help clarify the whole President Obama, Jonah thing.
Sure.
There's so much misinformation out there.
That's important.
I approached it with my very conservative husband at that federal rights versus states' rights, and then he was hung up because he believed so strongly in states' rights.
Yes.
But then he didn't know where to go.
Basically, what the Defense of Marriage Act did was it suspended states' rights by saying we normally have a full faith and credit clause. And the full faith and credit clause says that if you have some type of legal status in one state, that your legal status holds when you move to another state. So, for instance, if you have a birth certificate from Arizona, as I do, when I go to New Mexico, I can offer my birth certificate as proof of whatever I need to offer as proof for, and it is recognized. Even though it's not from New Mexico, full faith and credit says that we're going to assume that the legal actions taken in another state are also good and binding in our state. Does that make sense? Okay. That's how you can use your driver's license when you go to other states without getting arrested. So DOMA basically suspended the full faith and credit clause simply around the issue of same-sex marriage. So it says, now look, straight marriages, we're going to recognize those when you move from state to state. When you move from Idaho to Arizona, you have to get remarried, right? Your marriage is the same in Idaho as it is in Arizona, and the laws apply to you the same. But if you're married in Iowa and you're gay and you come to Arizona, you are no longer married in Iowa. Like, the state will not recognize your marriage. Interesting, because there are a lot of legal quandaries that pop up. For instance, if you're married in Iowa and you come to Arizona and want to get divorced, you can't. Gay couple can't get divorced in Arizona because they're not married, right? Yeah. So it's really it's been quite problematic for gay families. The issue not only has been around marriage, but also children and custody issues as well. It's become quite problematic. So what President Obama basically said was that he feels that DOMA is indefensible, that it discriminates against people, it denies the recognition of full faith and credit, and he can no longer defend it in good faith. And so he's instructed his Department of Justice to no longer fight lawsuits that challenge DOMA's
But they will enforce the law.
constitutionality.
The law will continue to be enforced. I think that's what
States that choose to enforce DOMA will still continue to do so, until or unless such time when a federal court rules DOMA unconstitutional. That has not happened, but that very question is winding its way through the courts right now. And what Obama said was that he's going to instruct his attorneys to no longer fight this case. So they're basically saying, we're wrong, you're right. So if the case were to stop now, then what would happen is that DOMA would no longer be an enforceable part of federal law, which means that if a state, states would recognize under the full faith and credit clause other people's marriages from other states. It would, and this is important, it would not require a state to begin officiating or performing or even accepting marriages that happen within their jurisdiction. What it would do is say you can no longer ignore the valid legal marriage that has occurred in another part of the country. Does that make sense? Okay. That's what the lawsuit's about. And I think it's a very important states' rights issue. Absolutely an important states' rights issue. Because DOMA basically subjugated the 10th Amendment when it passed and said that states don't get to make the decision. We will make the decision for them.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. Does that directive from the President, in essence, prevent the Solicitor General from defending DOMA in the Supreme Court?
It prevents the Department of Justice from defending the case, yes. So no longer will the Department of Justice show up as a defendant in these cases. They will not appeal. So whatever ruling comes from a court, they will just accept that ruling and not appeal. Now this sounds like a really big deal,